The chamber was already burning when I arrived. Not literally. The lights in the Grand Council Hall of Avalon Station were still on. The air was still breathable, and the curved walls of transparent alloy still showed the sweep of open space beyond. But the session had started 40 minutes before schedule, which meant the situation was worse than the overnight reports had suggested, and the overnight reports had already been the worst I had seen in 60 years of diplomatic service. I am Kale Knox of the Syntherian Collective. I have served as an ambassador to the Galactic Council for longer than most species in this hall have had faster-than-light travel. I have watched empires fall, alliances crumble, and civilizations quietly stop sending transmissions. I thought at my age, I had seen everything the universe could produce in the way of despair. I had not. Counselor Veth of the Ardanian Union was speaking when I took my seat. She is a tall, gray-skinned being with 4 arms and a voice like low thunder, and she was not bothering to keep her composure. Her second set of arms, the one she normally folds behind her back in a gesture of diplomatic restraint, were pressed flat against the table. That meant she was frightened. In 40 years of sitting across from Veth in budget negotiations, treaty disputes, and border conflicts, I had never seen her frightened. She was speaking about the Vreth Dominion. Everyone in the hall was speaking about the Vreth Dominion. The Vreth had arrived at the edge of mapped space 112 years ago. They had not introduced themselves. They had not sent an ambassador. They had disabled the listening station at Outpost Farron 7 within 3 hours of their first contact, and then sent a single line of text through the wreckage of its communication array. Withdraw or be absorbed. The Council had not withdrawn. 41 fleets later, we were all in this room, and Veth was pressing her hands flat on the table. The Vreth were not simply a military power. Any species with enough determination and time could build a large fleet. The Vreth were something different. Their ships carried adaptive shielding technology that learned from every weapon fired at them. The longer a battle lasted, the harder it became to damage them. Their soldiers wore suits that monitored their own biology in real time and corrected for fatigue, pain, and fear through chemical intervention. They did not panic. They did not hesitate. They had never, in 112 years of recorded contact, made a tactical error born of emotion. They were also patient. Terribly, enormously patient. They would besiege a planet for 11 years. They would wait outside a defended system until the defenders ran out of fuel. They had once, according to the files I had memorized on a shuttle ride here, allowed a resistance movement to believe it had won a victory for 4 full years before they corrected that impression at a cost of 600 million lives. Veth finished her statement. The chamber voted on her proposal, which was to offer the Vreth the outer 40% of council-held space in exchange for a permanent ceasefire. 31 species voted in favor. 8 abstained. 3 voted against. I was one of the 3. Not because I believed we could win. I had read the same projections everyone else had read. Our combined fleet strength, after 4 decades of sustained losses, was down to approximately 19% of its peak capability. The Vreth had lost ships too, but they built faster than we did, and they did not mourn their dead the way we mourned ours, which meant they did not slow down to grieve. We did. I voted against because the 40% of space we would surrender contained 11 inhabited worlds. Worlds with people on them. Worlds that had joined the Council because we told them they would be protected. The vote failed to reach the threshold needed for action, which meant nothing happened, which was the worst possible outcome because while nothing happened in here, something was very much happening out there. A staff member from communications placed a data tablet in front of me during the recess. I looked at it. Then I looked at it again. The Vreth fleet that had been sitting on the edge of the Syndron Reach for 3 months had moved. It was now positioned between us and the last functioning repair station on the western arm. They had not fired a single shot. They did not need to. The message was mathematical. Our remaining fleet could not sustain itself without that station, and they were now between us and it. I sat in the corridor outside the chamber and did something I had not done in a professional setting in 30 years. I pulled up a file marked with a red quarantine seal and read it from the beginning. The file was titled simply, Species Designation 7G, Common name, self-assigned, human. Planet of origin, Earth, third orbit of a medium yellow star. Unremarkable system in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. Biological classification, carbon-based, bilaterally symmetrical, remarkably fragile. Average lifespan without medical intervention, approximately 80 years. With medical intervention, variable, improving, and in some documented cases now exceeding 200. The quarantine had been established 203 years ago by a council vote of 40-2. The stated reason was that humans were an unstable species with a documented history of widespread conflict, unpredictable decision-making, and a pattern of behavior that no council psychologist had been able to model reliably. The actual reason, which I had suspected for decades and confirmed by reading between the lines of the sealed session transcripts, was that 3 different council species had attempted to make first contact with humanity, and all 3 had come back shaken in ways they struggled to articulate. One envoy, a Syntherian like me, had written in his personal log. They laughed. I told them about the dangers of open space, the civilizations that had fallen, the scale of what existed beyond their atmosphere. They laughed, and then they asked me how fast my ship was, and when I told them, they asked if they could take a look at the engine. Another envoy from the Drawn Collective had written simply, "Do not underestimate them. Whatever you do, do not." I held the tablet in my hands and thought about the 11 worlds that would fall under Vreth control if we did nothing. I thought about the ceasefire proposal that would not pass. I thought about Veth's hands pressed flat on the table. Then I went back into the chamber and asked for the floor. The room was quiet when I explained what I intended to propose. Not the usual diplomatic quiet of people waiting politely. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone in a room has the same thought at the same moment and none of them want to say it first. I said it. I proposed opening the quarantine channel and contacting Earth. 3 counselors left the chamber. 2 species representatives began speaking to each other in low, urgent voices. Veth looked at me for a long time with no expression at all, which was her version of being very, very unsettled. The vote was closer than I expected. 14 in favor, 22 against, 6 abstaining. Not enough. I asked for a second vote. I was technically out of procedure. The chair allowed it anyway, because the chair had also read the overnight projections. The second vote, 19 in favor, 17 against, 6 still abstaining. It passed. I walked to the communications bay myself. I did not trust anyone else to send the transmission with the right tone. Tone, in diplomacy, is almost everything. I had spent 60 years learning that. I looked at the quarantine frequency for a moment. It had not been used in 203 years. I checked that it was still active. Someone had been maintaining it. I chose not to think too hard about that. I opened the channel. I said, in the clearest version of the human language I had practiced twice on the shuttle ride over, "This is Ambassador Kalenox of the Galactic Council. We are contacting Earth on an emergency basis. We need help." I released the transmission key. The signal went out at maximum range, aimed at the coordinates where Earth's sun should be by now, accounting for drift. 17 seconds of silence. Then a voice came back. It was clear, warm, and slightly amused. A human voice, speaking in their own language, which my earpiece translated without delay. "Finally, we were wondering when you would call." I sat down slowly in the communications chair. I had prepared for many possible responses. Suspicion, hostility, confusion, a demand for explanation. I had not prepared for that. "You were aware we might contact you?" I asked. "We've been watching the Vreth situation for about 60 years, the voice said. A woman's voice. Calm, very calm. "We figured you'd run out of other options eventually. We have a delegation ready. Where do you want us?" I gave her the coordinates for Avalon Station. She said they would be there in 11 days. I walked back through the corridor toward the council chamber, and I noticed that my hands were not shaking. That was surprising. I had expected them to shake. I had just made the most consequential decision of my career, possibly the most consequential decision the council had made in 2 centuries, and my hands were perfectly steady. I think it was because for the first time since the overnight reports had started getting worse, I felt something other than dread. I felt something that took me a moment to identify because it had been so long since I had experienced it. I felt curious. The 11 days were the longest of my career, and my career had included a 14-month hostage negotiation on a station with no working heating system. Every morning, I reviewed the Vreth fleet movement reports. Every morning, the numbers were slightly worse. The fleet near the repair station had not moved, but a second Vreth formation had positioned itself at the edge of the Thandric system, which contained one of our last operational shipyards. They were not attacking. They were simply present, in the way that a sealed door is simply present. You can stand in front of it as long as you like. The door doesn't care. On the fourth day, the Ardanian Union formally requested permission to begin separate negotiations with the Vreth. I voted against allowing it. So did 11 others. The motion failed. Veth looked at me across the table and said nothing. On the seventh day, the human vessel appeared on long-range sensors. Our tracking officers spent an hour trying to classify it before admitting that they couldn't. It did not match any known design in our records, which covered approximately 9,000 distinct spacecraft configurations across 400 years of cataloging. The hull read as some kind of titanium-carbon hybrid, which was not unusual. The engine output was unusual. It was producing roughly 3 times the thrust that a hull that size should have been able to sustain without structural failure. One of my staff, a young Syntherian named Orville who had never worked with humans before, looked at the sensor data and said, "It appears to be structurally compromised." "It appears to be going very fast," I said. On the 9th day, I received a short text-only message from the approaching vessel. It read, "We're bringing 40 people. We'll need a space to work. Somewhere with a lot of wall space. We like to put things on walls. Also, do you have coffee? We brought some, but we'd rather not use our own supply this early." I had Orville locate a suitable workspace with large walls. I also located coffee. I was not entirely sure what coffee was, but I found 3 kilograms of it in the station supply manifest under the category of trade goods, legacy class, which meant it had been sitting in storage for a very long time and nobody had known what to do with it. On the 11th day, the ship docked. I was in the docking bay when the ramp came down. I had dressed in my formal diplomatic attire, which for a Syntherian means layered silver fabric and a seal of office at the collar. I had briefed my staff on human greeting customs. I had reviewed my notes. I had prepared 3 different opening statements, depending on whether the delegation arrived with a formal posture, a neutral posture, or an informal posture. The first human off the ship was eating something. It was a small, dense object that she bit into with evident satisfaction, and she was walking while eating, which no council species does in a formal setting, and she was wearing what I recognized from my files as a military uniform, though it had been modified in several places in ways that the files did not account for. She was a tall woman with dark skin and close-cut hair, and the kind of easy, unhurried stride that either meant she was completely relaxed or completely in control of herself. Possibly both. She saw me, finished chewing, swallowed, and held out her right hand. I knew this gesture. I took it. She shook my hand twice, firmly, without excessive force. "Kelnox," she said. "Yes." "Commander Petra Osei, United Earth Expeditionary Command." She looked around the docking bay with an expression of mild professional interest, the way a builder might look at a structure they were assessing for renovation. "Nice station." "How old?" "Approximately 140 years, I said. "We'll try not to put too many holes in it." She said this completely without humor, and then, a half-second later, smiled slightly to indicate that it was, in fact, a small joke. "Is there somewhere we can work?" I showed her to the room with the large walls. Her people moved in around her with the efficiency of a species that had been doing this for a very long time, which they had not, technically, but which they nonetheless appeared to have been doing. Within 20 minutes, the walls were covered. Physical maps, printed documents, screen feeds, strings of notation that I did not recognize as any mathematical system I'd studied. One of her people, a young man with red hair who was introduced to me only as Callum, was building what appeared to be a physical model of the Vreth fleet formation using small magnetic markers on a flat table surface. I stood at the edge of the room and watched them work and felt the particular disorientation that comes from watching someone else's mind in motion. Commander Osei sat down across from me when her people had settled. She folded her hands on the table. She had a data pad in front of her, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at me. "Tell me about the Vreth," she said. I told her. I had given this briefing 7 times in the past year, to emergency sessions, to Allied fleet commanders, to the Council's own strategic committee. I knew how to tell it efficiently. Fleet strength, adaptive shielding, weapon systems, documented engagements, casualty figures, current positioning. She let me finish without interrupting, which I appreciated. Then she asked, "What do they do when they're bored?" I stopped. "I am Sore. Long campaigns. Sieges. When nothing is happening for months on end. What do their soldiers do? What do their commanders do? Do they have recreation? Social structures aboard ships? Do they sleep in shifts or all at once? Do they have anything they do just because they enjoy it?" I looked at her. "I don't know," I said. That information was never considered relevant to strategic planning. She nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something she already suspected. "Have I ever fought an enemy that was willing to take serious losses in order to achieve a specific goal? Not out of desperation, out of choice. Their adaptive shielding makes serious losses unlikely for their opponents to inflict," I said. "That's not what I asked." "No," I admitted. "Based on the records, their opponents have generally sought to minimize losses. It is the tactically sound approach when facing adaptive shielding, since a longer engagement only strengthens their defensive capability." "How long do their soldiers go without sleep during active operations?" The file suggests their biological modification suits can suppress sleep need for approximately 90 hours. She made a note, not on the data pad, on a small paper notebook, with a physical pen. I stared at this for a moment. Then I looked away. "The shielding," she said, "it learns from weapons fired at it. Does it also learn from weapons that are withheld?" I opened my mouth, closed it. That question has not, to my knowledge, been explored. She wrote something else in the notebook. Then she looked up at me and said, "One more question for now. When they take a planet, what do they do with the people on it?" This was the question I had hoped she would not ask yet. "They integrate them," I said carefully. "Subject populations are given a choice between service to the Dominion and what the Vreth call resource reclassification, which is—" "I understand what it is," she said quietly. Not aggressively, just quietly. The way someone speaks when they have already done the reading and do not need the gentle version. "Thank you, Kale Knox. I think we have what we need to start." "You have what you need," I said. "From one briefing. From 60 years of observation plus one briefing," she said. She stood, which apparently signaled the end of the meeting, though she had not announced it. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. When you made the vote to contact us, the second vote, the one that passed, were you afraid of what we might do, or afraid of what might happen if you didn't call us?" I thought about this honestly, because she was asking honestly. "Both," I said, but the second fear was larger. She nodded. "Good answer." She picked up her pen and turned back to the wall of maps. "We'll have an initial proposal ready in 48 hours. One of your staff can show Callum where the coffee is." I was almost at the door when the young counselor from the Branaxi delegation, who had been quietly observing from chair in the corner, spoke up. He was new to his position. He still had the habit of asking the questions that experienced diplomats had learned to swallow. "Commander Osei," he said, "why weren't you afraid when we called?" "The Vreth have destroyed 40 fleets." The room went a little quieter. Osei did not turn around immediately. She was looking at one of the maps on the wall. Then she turned, and her expression was not dramatic. It was simply honest. "Because we have been watching them for 100 years, she said, "and we have been waiting for permission to be angry." Nobody said anything after that. The young counselor sat back in his chair. I walked out into the corridor, and I stood there for a moment with my hand resting on the wall, and I thought about that word, permission, as though they had held something back deliberately for a century. As though there was something waiting behind the quarantine seal that had nothing to do with instability or unpredictability. As though the council had not kept humanity out. As though humanity had been waiting to be let in. I went to find Orville and told him to bring the coffee to the room with the maps. All 3 kilograms of it. I want to tell you what Phase Mongrel looks like from inside. I am Commander Petra Osei, and I have been planning this for 11 years. Not this specific mission, not these specific coordinates, but this moment, this type of moment, the moment when everything the Vreth have built their certainty around stops working the way they expect. I have been planning for this moment since I was 26 years old and read the first classified assessment of Vreth tactical behavior that Earth Command ever produced. The assessment was 60 pages long and written by a woman named Dr. Edith Callow, who had spent 19 years analyzing every piece of data on the Vreth that could be gathered without direct contact. It was methodical, thorough, and in most places deeply concerning. But on page 53, there was a paragraph that I have read so many times I can recite it without looking. Dr. Callow wrote, "The Vreth's greatest tactical strength is also, in a specific and exploitable sense, their greatest liability. They're a species that has optimized entirely for certainty. They do not guess. They do not improvise. They project, model, and execute with extraordinary precision. This means they're genuinely, structurally vulnerable to an enemy who does not behave in ways that can be modeled. Not an enemy that is random, which any sufficient model can account for, but an enemy whose decisions arise from values and motivations that the Vreth have no referent for. An enemy, in short, that does things for reasons the Vreth find incomprehensible." She left a note in the margin of her own document. I found this when I accessed the original file. In small handwriting, in blue ink, she had written, "We qualify." I thought about Dr. Callow a lot in the 48 hours after we arrived on Avalon Station. I thought about her while Callum rebuilt the fleet map 4 times using updated sensor feeds. I thought about her while my weapons specialist, a woman named Diane Howell, who had been doing this longer than almost anyone else on the team, walked me through the adaptive shielding analysis. Diane had a theory. The shielding learned from energy weapon signatures. It cataloged kinetic impact profiles. It mapped electromagnetic interference patterns. But Diane had noticed, buried in 40 years of engagement reports, that in every battle where Council fleet had deliberately changed its weapon output mid-engagement, the shielding adaptation had lagged by between 4 and 11 seconds. 4 to 11 seconds does not sound like much. In a space engagement where targeting solutions update every half second, it is an enormous amount of time. The shielding learned, but it learned from what had already happened, not from what might happen next. It was, in the most specific technical sense, reactive. We are not reactive. Phase Mongrel, I explained to Cale Knox on the second morning, when he came to the workroom with another counselor whose name I kept forgetting and a written list of 14 questions from the Strategic Committee, is not a battle plan. I want to be clear about that. It is a behavioral strategy. The goal is not to destroy the Vreth fleet. The goal is to make the Vreth fleet stop being certain. Cale Knox wrote something down. The other counselor looked like he might be sick. I continued. We're going to engage them in a way that their models cannot account for. Some of it will look tactically irrational. Some of it will be tactically irrational by conventional standards. We're going to fire weapons in patterns derived from non-combat sources. We are going to change formation using movement algorithms that are not in any military database because they were never written for military use. We're going to do things that will make their projection systems return null results, and when that happens, their commanders will have to make decisions without data. And if they simply choose to overwhelm you with numbers? Cale Knox asked. That's a valid approach, I said. It might even work. But here's the thing about an enemy that has never lost. They don't actually know how to absorb a serious, sustained, confusing fight. They know how to execute. They don't know how to adapt on the fly. That's what we do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," I said. "People are going to get hurt. I'm not pretending otherwise. But the alternative is letting them take 11 inhabited worlds, and that is not something I am willing to put in a report as an acceptable outcome." On day 4, we moved. I want to describe this accurately because I think the Council's records of what happened over the next 18 days will be written by people who were watching from sensor feeds and statistical projections. And those records will be technically correct, but will miss the texture of it entirely. The first engagement was at the edge of the Syndran Reach, 40,000 kilometers from the repair station the Vreth had boxed in. We came in from an angle that no tactical projection would suggest because it put us momentarily in a less advantageous position relative to their weapons range. We accepted that disadvantage on purpose. We fired the first volley in a pattern derived from a piece of music, not as a gimmick, as a weapon. The firing intervals, the spread angles, the energy output variation across the sequence. None of it matched any combat signature the Vreth shielding had cataloged, because it had been composed for sound rather than for war, and the shielding took 7 seconds to begin adapting. In those 7 seconds, we hit 3 of their destroyers with enough force to knock them out of formation. Then we pulled back. The Vreth pursuit was immediate and exactly what their tactical doctrine predicted, a coordinated sweep designed to cut off our retreat vector. It was a very good sweep. Against any opponent who had gotten 7 seconds of advantage and then tried to hold a defensive line, it would have worked perfectly. We did not hold a defensive line. We split into 8 groups and went in 8 different directions simultaneously, and then 3 of those groups turned around and re-engaged from behind the pursuit formation. I could see on my tactical display the moment the Vreth fleet's coordination began to show micro delays. Small ones, less than a second each. But they were there in a fleet that had never shown coordination delays before because their projection systems were running 4 scenarios simultaneously and none of the 4 matched what we were actually doing. On day 7, we did something that I know the Council's historians will call controversial. We disabled a Vreth troop carrier. We could have destroyed it. We had the capability at that moment. Instead, we put a boarding team on it, extracted the crew without injury, sealed them safely in the rear compartment with food, water, and functioning life support, and left the ship drifting with an open communication channel. The message we left, recorded in the Vreth language, which 3 members of my team spoke fluently, was, "You can come and get them." We left the engine core intact. I watched Kale Knox's face when he received the sensor report of this. He had been monitoring our engagements from Avalon Station. His expression cycled through several things before settling on something I can only describe as deeply confused wonder. "You let them go," he said when we spoke that evening. "We secured their personnel, made sure nobody was hurt, and returned them. That is not a standard military action." "No," I agreed. "It's not. That's the point. The Vreth do not have a model for an enemy that wins an engagement and then helps you. They have never encountered it. Right now, somewhere in their command structure, there's a projection system trying to understand what our goal was, and it is not finding an answer, and that is making someone very uncomfortable." "You are using mercy as a weapon," Kale Knox said. He sounded like he was recalibrating something fundamental about how he understood the universe. "I am using everything as a weapon," I said. "That is what humans do. We're sorry about it." "Sort of." On day 9, the Vreth High Commander sent a transmission on a broad channel. He spoke in the Vreth language, which is formal and precise and has almost no capacity for ambiguity, which is itself a tactical limitation when you think about it. He said, "Your strategy is irregular. Explain your tactical objective, or we will execute the civilian population of the nearest council-held settlement." The channel was open. Kale Knox was listening. The entire council was listening. My crew was listening. I leaned into the transmission key and replied in the Vreth language, clearly and without dramatic pause. "We do not have one. That is what makes us dangerous." I released the key. My comms officer, a young man named Owen Briggs, who was 22 years old and had never been in a real engagement before this mission, looked at me from across the console with an expression that was exactly half exhilaration and half terror. "Did that actually work?" he asked. "No idea," I said honestly. "But they're going to spend the next 6 hours trying to model what it meant, and 6 hours is 6 hours." Owen processed this. Then he nodded slowly, like someone accepting a new way of looking at things. "Right," he said. 6 hours is 6 hours. I need to tell you about the day the mathematics changed. I am Kale Knox again. I am back in the council chamber, and the chamber is quieter than I have ever heard it because what is happening on the sensor feeds is so far outside any strategic framework any of us were trained in that we have collectively run out of commentary. It was day 12 of the human engagement when the Vreth did what a cornered, confused enemy almost always does. They went for the soft target. The Thandric system had 7 planets. One of them, Thandric 4, had a population of approximately 3 million. They were not all the same species. They were a mixed colony, the kind that forms over a century or two when people from different worlds decide that a particular planet has good soil and decent atmosphere and enough distance from old conflicts to be worth the investment. There were Ardanians on Thandric 4. There were Syntherians. There are 2 species I do not have a name for in this language. Small and very old civilizations who had been careful and quiet and had joined the council 70 years ago because they were told it was the safest thing to do. They had been told that by me, actually. I had been part of the delegation that negotiated their membership. The Vreth fleet at Thandric had not moved in 30 days. That was the reason we had not assigned any additional assets to it. Stationary was, in all our models, the least threatening posture. A fleet that does not move is buying time, or it is waiting for a trigger. It was waiting for a trigger. When the Vreth fleet in the Sindran Reach began showing its first signs of genuine tactical confusion, the Thandric fleet moved. It moved hard and fast toward the planet, and the tactical projection that hit my screen gave the orbital intercept at 4 hours and 17 minutes. The Council voted in emergency session. 22 species voted to accept a partial withdrawal, not total surrender. Just a strategic repositioning that would, in practice, mean leaving Thandric 4 outside our defensive perimeter. The motion was introduced as a temporary reallocation of defensive assets pending strategic review. It meant 3 million people. I knew what it meant. I raised my hand and voted yes. I want to be precise about that. I voted yes because the projection model said we did not have sufficient assets to defend Thandric and maintain the Sindran engagement simultaneously, and the Sindran engagement was going well by any measure, and a commander with good strategic sense chooses which fights can be held and which cannot. I voted yes, and I hate that I voted yes. The vote was 26-16. The motion passed. I looked at the communication screen. I looked at the feed from the Sindran Reach. Then I realized I was not seeing the human fleet on the feed because the human fleet was not in the Sindran Reach anymore. They had already moved. 17 human ships were heading toward Thandric at a velocity that was, according to my tactical officer's report, roughly impossible for ships of that mass without structural damage to the engines. When my officer said this, I asked him to check again. He checked. He said, "The engine output is consistent with structural damage. They appear to be exceeding the safe operational limit by approximately 30%. Are they aware of this?" I asked. He paused. They appear to be aware of this. The engine configurations look deliberate. There was a Bernaxi counselor sitting to my left who said, quietly, "They're going to lose the engines. They won't be able to get back." I said nothing. Commander Osei had not asked for permission. She had not transmitted a request for authorization. She had not sent a plan of action for council review. She had simply redirected the entire human contingent toward a system that the council had just voted to abandon in 4 hours and 12 minutes because that was how long they had. I opened a channel to the human fleet. "Commander Osei, the council has authorized a reallocation of..." "I read the vote," she said. Her voice was completely level. There was a lot of noise behind her, the kind of noise that comes from a working bridge running at full capacity. "Respectfully, Ambassador, I don't work for the Council. What is your intention?" "To be between that fleet and that planet when they arrive," she said. "We can discuss authorization afterward." "The numbers are not favorable," I said. 17 ships against their formation is not. Kale Knox. She used my name plainly, without title. I know what the numbers say. I grew up learning that the numbers about humanity were always wrong. I choose to believe that's still true. Now I need to focus. We'll talk when it's done. The channel closed. I sat in the council chamber and watched the feed. I had no authority to stop her and no ability to help her and nothing to do but watch, which is one of the hardest things a person can do. The human fleet arrived at Thandrick with 11 minutes to spare. What happened over the next 6 hours is not something I can describe in full, because the engagement was moving faster than any display could render cleanly. What I can tell you is what I observed in sections. I observed 17 ships moving in patterns that my tactical officer eventually identified as derived from something called the murmuration of starlings, which was apparently a natural phenomenon from Earth, in which large numbers of small birds moved in coordinated, fluid formations that appear to have no fixed center. The Vreth fleet targeted the apparent center repeatedly and found nothing there because there was no center. The formation shifted and flowed and was never in the place their targeting predicted. I observed human ships taking damage. Real damage. Hull breaches, power system failures, engine loss. One ship lost attitude control for 8 minutes and drifted in a long arc before recovering. They did not break formation. They incorporated the damaged ship's drift into the pattern, and the pattern continued. My tactical officer said, "They're using the damaged ship as a variable." He sounded personally offended by this, the way a craftsman sounds when someone uses their tools in a way the tools were not designed for, and it works anyway. I observed, at the 4-hour mark, that the Vreth fleet had slowed its approach by 30%, not because it was taking unsustainable losses, because its projection systems were returning null results on the human fleet's likely next position, and a Vreth fleet without a projection to execute does not improvise. It halts and recalculates. And then I observe the moment that I will spend the rest of my life trying to accurately describe. The communications feed from a human fleet was open. Commander Osei had left it open from the beginning, which I had assumed was a command monitoring preference. It was not. The feed was playing music. Old Earth music, recorded in the style of a much earlier century. Simple and strong and sung by human voices. I do not know the name of the piece. I intend to find out. It was not solemn. It was almost joyful, in a way that should not have made sense given what was happening around it. My staff was quiet. The chamber was quiet. A council member from the Greth Protectorate, who is an old being and very difficult to impress, leaned toward me and said in a low voice, "Why are they doing that?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "It seems defiant," he said. "I think it is," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How very unusual." Kilnox, I thought. Yes, how very unusual. There's a 19-year-old on Commander Osei's crew named Owen Briggs. I learned his name later from the engagement logs. He was the comms officer. And at some point during the 6th hour of that engagement, when the Vreth fleet had slowed to a near halt and the human formation was holding its position between the fleet and the planet, Osei asked him how he was doing. He said, "I have a dog back home, Commander. Lab mix. Name's Copper. I need to get back to feed him." She said, "Then let's make sure we get back." That is the kind of thing that does not appear in strategic assessments. It does not fit into a projection model. But it is the thing that I think, when I write the final account of these events, will be closest to the true explanation of what happened. 3 million people on Thandrick Fort did not know the names of the people defending them. They did not know about the music, or the dog, or the impossible engine output, or the murmuration of starlings. They knew only that the Vreth fleet had stopped, and then slowly, over the course of a long night, had begun to withdraw. The Vreth do not retreat. In 112 years of recorded engagement, they had never withdrawn from a committed offensive position. Until that night, the withdrawal was not dramatic. It was not signaled by transmission or a formal declaration. The fleet simply began moving backward, slowly and precisely, in a way that a very certain, very controlled being moves when it has encountered something it cannot explain and has chosen to put distance between itself and that thing. I watched it on the sensor feed for a long time. The next day, the Vreth High Commander sent a transmission directly to the Council, not to the human fleet, to us. He said, "We will discuss terms." He did not say terms of what. He did not need to. I went to the workroom with the maps and walls and found Commander Osei sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and a cup of coffee in both hands. The walls around her were covered in everything her team had produced all the data and the patterns and the modeling, and she looked at it all with the expression of someone who has just finished a very difficult piece of work and is not yet sure what to feel. I sat down on the floor beside her, which my knees objected to, but I sat there anyway. Well, I said. Well, she agreed. The Vreth want to discuss terms. I know. I read the transmission. What do you think they will ask for? She thought about it, genuinely, not diplomatically. I think they'll ask for something that looks like a victory so they can tell their people it was a victory. Most things end that way. You give them a door they can walk through without too much loss of face, and they walk through it. And later, everyone pretends the door was always there. And what do you want from this? I asked. She turned and looked at me. For the people on Thandric 4 to still be living in their homes in 10 years. For the 11 worlds in the ceasefire proposal to stay off the table. For whatever species the Vreth have already absorbed to get some kind of formal recognition and protection in the treaty language. She paused. And I want the Vreth biological research files. All of them. I had not expected that. Why? Because Dr. Kalos' last paper, the one she never published, argued that the Vreth's biological modification program has some components that could, with significant adaptation, be used to treat a degenerative neural condition that affects about 40 million people across 12 species. She took a sip of her coffee. She died before she could pursue it. I've been carrying her files for 9 years. I'd like to do something with them. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, Kelnox to Osei, may I ask you something personal? She almost smiled. I told you. You could just call me Petra. Petra, I said, when the council voted to abandon Thandric, and you moved anyway, were you afraid? She looked at the walls covered in maps and data. She looked at her coffee. Then she looked at the ceiling, which had a small scuff mark on it that one of her crew had made with an equipment case on the first day. Of course I was afraid, she said. I'm always afraid. Being afraid is just information. It tells you what matters. She looked at me. The thing about humans, Kelnox, the thing your files probably got wrong, is that we're not brave because we're not afraid. We're brave because we are afraid and we go anyway. Because someone back home needs to be gone back to. Because 3 million strangers on a planet we've never visited deserve a chance to grow old on their own soil. She paused. Because being afraid and doing nothing feels worse than being afraid and doing something. It's not complicated. It just looks complicated from the outside. I thought about my official report. I had been thinking about how to write it for days. I knew now what it would say. I wrote it that evening. I wrote it carefully in the formal register that council reports require, but I made sure the words were honest. The final paragraph took me a long time, and I rewrote it 4 times before I was satisfied. This is what it said. Humanity is not dangerous because they destroy. They are dangerous because they refuse to. They fight as though they have everything to lose, and then when it is over, they act as though the enemy was simply someone they had not met yet. I voted to call them as a last resort. I understand now that they were always the first answer. We simply were not ready for them yet. The quarantine was lifted by unanimous vote the following morning. All 42 council species voted in favor, even the 6 that had abstained from every other vote during the crisis. Veth voted in favor and did not press her hands flat on the table. I sent the vote result to Commander Osei, who read it and then went back to her coffee. Owen Briggs, I later confirmed, made it home to Copper the dog. I thought Petra would want to know that. She said she already knew. She made a point, she said, of always knowing. That is the kind of thing that is very hard to put in a strategic report. But I wrote it in anyway.